This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with the Honourable Linda Dessau, AC CVO. Many things about Linda's life and career have been quite amazing. She began her law degree at the ripe old age of 16 and was admitted to practice at 21. As a magistrate, she served in the Children's Court, Coroners Court and Melbourne Magistrates Court. She went on to serve as a judge in the Family Court of Australia for 18 years and of course became the first female governor of our state of Victoria. Part of Linda's success has been born out of saying yes to everything and backing herself. After a few years of practice, she wanted to get out and explore the world. So in what seemed like a risky career move to some, she up and left her law firm to travel. And even though this 18-month adventure did not directly advance her career, she did manage to employ her legal skills at various times.
Like so many people travelling in Europe, I thought it would be better to spend the European winter in Israel than right in the depths of all that cold. And it turned out to be a wonderful experience because, by request, I worked only outdoors. You know, I'd already been a lawyer for 3-4 years and I didn't want to do anything other than farming. I really wanted to learn how that worked. And you say I honed my legal skills. People might wonder what the connection is, how you hone your legal skills when you're picking oranges. But I think what you might be thinking of is I found that the volunteers worked, and I was one of the volunteers, tended to work quite slowly, and it frustrated me because we were on this beautiful Mediterranean coast and I thought if only we could work faster, maybe we could get more time off and enjoy the beach. So I spoke to the kibbutzniks who ran the orange grove and I said, look, why don't you set us a quota? Just set us a quota for how much you want us to pick in a day, and I think I can get us working so that we'll get the quota, provided we then get time off and we can finish work for the day. Well, they loved it, but so did the other volunteers, because then we all started picking like crazy and we were lying on the beach within a couple of hours. So if you call that a honing of legal skills, yes, I'm guilty of that.
Our guest this morning in Lives in the Law is Linda Dessau, recently retired Governor of the state of Victoria, a long-time family court judge, magistrate, someone with a very distinguished career in the law. Linda, good morning.
Good morning.
So we'll get back to the start. Your dad was a person who had to flee Europe, really, pre-Second World War, because of the Holocaust, or the impending Holocaust and the impending Second World War. He met your mother here and they married. She was born in Australia and they married here in Australia. Growing up in those circumstances with a parent who had had to flee Europe because of the impending Holocaust, did that impact upon you and your siblings?
It had a huge influence. I think from the very beginning, Michael, we knew how lucky we were to be born in Australia. My dad left us in no doubt about that at all. He always thought it was a lucky country. It was a safe haven for him and for many others. It was a land of great opportunity. And he instilled in us from the earliest age that we should be grateful to be here and we should contribute to it.
And there was an ethic of working hard and taking advantage of the opportunities.
You know, like every migrant who comes to this country, that ethic, I think, is really at the heart of the opportunity that they're grasping. It's just work hard in this lucky place and you can achieve. So we did have that also instilled in us, but it was really that sense of gratitude that we're in a place where we were so fortunate because it was safe.
As I've been known to say, the greatest gift anyone can have is good parents, and I think you may have got good parents.
I got good parents, and, you know, later as a family court judge, and even earlier than that as a children's court magistrate, I could look back and appreciate what a lottery it is, and that I happened to be born into a very secure and happy family, and gee, that sets you up well.
My word. Moving ahead, because a lot of ground to cover with your career, you finished secondary school at 16, which is unusual, and you need to be 18 to commence law, and in fact you were thinking of doing psychiatry or psychology before that.
I think social work at that point.
Social work.
Yeah.
But you needed to be 19
Yes.
and even 18 to get into law. How did you wangle?
How did I do it?
Yes.
Look, first of all, I think I was very young because I was the fourth of four children, and I think my parents just kind of got rid of me, handed me over to school very young. And I went all the way through being a couple of years younger than many of my contemporaries. I wanted to do social work. They were absolutely adamant that you needed more maturity, but apparently you didn't need that much more maturity for law. And so I, in a very plucky way, looking back, I didn't really think about it at the time, made an appointment to see one of the senior people in the law school and argued my case as to why they should let me start law. Now, I would love you and your listeners to believe that I was such a good advocate that it was easy. In fact, at the end of my advocacy, when I was waiting for their, very significant decision, the answer that came was, well, dear, you have a lovely smile. I think we'll let you start law. Something that I look back, imagine saying that to someone now. But at the time, my only response to myself was, great, I'm starting law.
And did you immediately dive into law and love it?
Not at all. I really didn't like it. And I think it's a terrific way of thinking, but it's quite contorted when you're not used to it. And it didn't sit well with me at all. I was very lucky by second year when I was thinking of giving up because I just didn't like the whole process of reading cases and analysing them. I spoke to a young lecturer who had just come back from the UK and was lecturing me in torts, and that was a young Gareth Evans. And I went to see him.
Can I just interpose later to be the Commonwealth Attorney General?
Yes. He had an amazing career. You could tell how bright he was then. He ultimately lectured me in constitutional law too. But that wouldn't have happened because I wouldn't have got that far in my law course but for what he said to me when I said I wanted to give up law. And he said, what don't you like? And I said, I don't like reading cases. He said, well, I don't like reading cases either. And there he was, the doyen of torts, talking about all these cases in detail. I said, so what do you do? And he said, well, I read the cases I have to read, but when I can, I just read a head note, and that gives me a good start. And so I started learning the tricks of the trade. And I don't mean that I didn't read another case, and particularly at uni, of course I did. But I did learn how to approach it a bit more economically so that it wasn't quite as painful. And then I think it gets easier the more you get into the way of thinking.
I think you mentioned somewhere when you know or learn what is expected of you in an exam, you can sort of regurgitate to them.
Yeah, there's a lot of technique involved. And I think the one who really taught me that was Marcia Neve, again, someone who went on to a very distinguished career in the Supreme Court. But Marcia was a superb lecturer, very, very clear, very succinct. I wrote down every word she said, gave those same words back to her in the exam, and she seemed to really like it. And I ended up doing well in equity, and by then I had the confidence to know how to approach a law exam.
And I like your comment you made about Marcia Neve, that it's not the subject matter, it's the teacher.
It really is, because a lot of people would say equity is a very difficult or complex subject. I found it incredibly logical and easy, and that was only because she was very logical and easy in the way she presented it. So I think a good lecturer makes a huge difference. And it was wonderful for me as a young girl to see a fairly young woman, as she was at the time, presenting so brilliantly.
So learning from good teachers, your law degree goes smoothly. And then in 1974, you do articles with E.L. Vale and McBain here in the city, just around the corner, in fact, in Lonsdale Street. What were articles like? There weren't many women in the profession at the time.
There weren't, but also even gaining articles was so different then. So you're going to have people listening to this who have gone through rounds of interviews and struggled to get articles, and not all of them would have got articles in firms or grad programs, grad positions in firms. It was incredibly easy then, and this is where I begin to age or date myself. But it really was a matter of you just picked up a phone to whomever. E.L. Vale and McBain was a very small but very old law firm. They'd been my father's solicitors for years, And they just expected that his daughter would do articles with them. And that's how I came to be the first young female articled clerk there. Look, at first it was hard. I can't pretend it wasn't. No one was used to having a female articled clerk. And I don't mean it was difficult for my principal or for the senior partners, but I particularly sensed a little bit of resentment at first from some of the secretarial staff. And I really understood it. They just didn't know quite what I was. Was I going to be uppity? Was I going to be friendly? Was I going to be difficult? So I did all the menial tasks that they quite wrongly assigned to me initially and spent some time with them. They got to know me, I got to know them, and it was really quite easy after that.
We're going to get to your career as we go through this, being involved intimately with criminal law and family law. Was that reflected in your articles? Either one of them reflected in your articles?
No, when I started articles, I really wanted to do commercial law. That's all I was interested in. I excelled in those subjects at university, and I thought that's where my future would lie. And my principal was fantastic, Ewan McBain. I don't think he saw that I was female or young. He was just so supportive and wanting to teach me and help me learn and help me excel. And so he took me to a conference with one of his very big commercial clients, an undertaker as it happened. And it was a long commercial meeting about a contract. And I really distinguished myself. I actually fell asleep.
The question from that, Linda, is what were you doing the night before?
Well, I was 20, so probably something fantastic, but I can't remember. I don't think I've got a good excuse. And Ewan was just so gentle and nice about it, and he didn't make a big point of it, but he just said he was wondering if I'd like to see perhaps a family law client the next day, and that's what happened.
And then your path followed family from then on? Or there was still a mix?
There was still a mix, and the beauty of doing articles at a firm like Vale and McBain was I did everything. I can remember a client ringing saying they needed a power of attorney, and I made this big long conference time for them to come in so I could take all the instructions until my principal explained that you just needed a name and address, basically. So, and that's how you learn during articles. That's the beauty of it. Yeah. And again, in a supportive environment where rather than yelling at me or being cross, he could see how funny it was, and you learn very quickly that way. So I did everything, and even after articles, I started doing everything, but I switched across to family law.
And after articles, you went to Wisewalls?
I did.
Why was that?
Look, again, it was just an era where you could pick and choose, and Wisewalls they were bigger. And they had a wonderful reputation as an old firm and good generalist sort of law firm. They did a lot of debt collecting, and people might think this is bizarre, but I actually thought that was interesting because I thought that there might be a possibility of opening something like a debt collecting agency, or I don't know why I thought that, but I was quite curious at the time. So Ian Dunn, who was the senior partner that I worked with most of the time, who went on to be obviously CEO at the Law Institute, he always teased me that I thought I was going to be a debt collector, and it didn't last very long. But it did mean that I got to do commercial litigation when I first went to them, and I would say to anyone that that is great grounding. If you ever want to be a litigator of any sort, or you want to work your way around courts, you learn very well basic lists up at the Magistrate's Court and then in the county court.
Because you have to get things right. You've got to dot your I's and cross your T's. And
it's fast and furious, and every single little nuance is coming across the bar table. And I used to do lists of about 30 cases at a time in front of different magistrates, so I learnt from them and about them and from and about opponents. It was really terrific.
And yet, at the end of about a year or so at Wisewalls, you take off travelling, which wasn't that common in my recollection. This is mid-70s.
Yeah. Well, look, a couple of things about that. I think, when I mentioned before how fortunate I was growing up, I think the greatest good fortune was the sense of self-confidence that my parents gave me. And that is the greatest gift, because if you have that, you tend to think, well, now I'll do this and that'll turn out okay, and then I'll come back and do that. And that's what happened. I just thought it was time. I was young. I hadn't done any of that sort of travel. And you'd remember you didn't take gap years in those days. It wasn't even something that any of us had heard of, the concept of a gap year. So I just felt the need for my own gap time at that stage. In fact, it was probably a little longer, Michael, than a year, because I had become quite well established before I left in family law. So I knew I had that.
To come back to.
Yeah.
And so did you come back to it? Coming back to practice as a solicitor or a barrister?
I came back to the bar. So Wisewolds were terrific to me. They actually made me an associate before I left. I did a couple of really strong years in family law, and the reason I chose family law then was not that it was my great passion at the time. In fact, in final year law, it was my lowest honour of subjects. But I chose family law because the new Act was starting. So I could see I could get in on the ground floor. So it was purely a pragmatic decision. And if I can say immodestly, it was a clever one because I knew as much about that new Act as anyone else did, even though I was 20-something. Ian Dunn was the most wonderful mentor because he is that old school generalist lawyer as well as a fantastic family lawyer. So I learnt so much from him. So the combination of having him helping teach me and a new Act made me really quite proficient quite quickly. So by the time I went away, I knew that I already had a specialty.
And maybe I should say for our younger listeners that prior to what you and I call the new Act, there was the Matrimonial Causes Act, which was a Victorian Act. Divorces were heard in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And you had to establish fault on the part of one of the parties.
Yes.
It's a pretty nasty system.
Very nasty and not nearly as appealing. And I bought into the vision. It was the Lionel Murphy vision of the new Family Law Act. And I really bought into that, as I did subsequently, and I know we'll get to it, but when I became a family court judge, that was very much the ethos of the family court then.
So you come back and you go straight to the bar. As a former clerk of a list at the bar, I was always very conscious of the need for young barristers to have a network of supporters, solicitors who they know who will brief them. Having been away for a year or more, did you have such a network?
I really did, and we'll probably come again. I took some more time off later when we went to Hong Kong. I'm a firm believer that the networks don't fade so fast. I think people should be confident in knowing that. I think it's hard if you don't have a network, but if you've established one, you can be away a year. I was subsequently away for 3 years, and I'd see people after that in William Street who'd say, I haven't seen you for a while. You know, they had no idea how long it was. So it was easy because, firms like Wisewolds would brief me, but I'd just dealt with so many other solicitors when I was a young solicitor, so that was one really big source of work. The other was I started lecturing at Leo Cusson, and honestly that's a fantastic thing to do. One, because it's the right thing to do and proper to help other people coming through. Two, you never learn anything as well as you learn it unless you're teaching it. It just helps you enormously. And thirdly, I just had this absolute conveyor belt of young solicitors coming through. I think I moved the admission of I don't know how many young lawyers because they knew me from being taught by me. And of course, if they go into family law, they don't know anyone and so they think of you. So that was a terrific source of work as well. And also times were easier. Your clerk even occasionally gave you something then.
You meet your husband, Tony Howard,
Yes.
former county court judge, at a bar dinner,
Yes.
early 80s.
Yes.
Late 70s, early 80s.
Who says that bar dinners are boring?
Well, not me. And then you and Tony get married, early 80s,
Yep.
and head off to Hong Kong to work there as Crown solicitors. Now, you've got no background in crime at that stage, I think.
That's right.
Had you pulled some sort of wool over the eyes of the Hong Kong authorities to promote yourself as a criminal barrister?
Of course I hadn't. We were actually Crown Counsel, so we were advocates in the Attorney General's chambers there. What happened was, look, again, by then I'd been at the bar a few years and wanted a bit more adventure. And Hong Kong was one of the few places we could go because they employed lawyers from around the Commonwealth. And so we set off together on what was a fantastic adventure. At that stage, it was unusual to be a married couple at the bar. There really was, I think, less than a handful. Now it's very, very common, which is natural given how many men and women there are at the bar. But we set off and we had 3 years prosecuting criminal trials. And you're absolutely right, I knew nothing about crime. So I had a couple of advantages. The major one was that Tony was a criminal barrister and amazingly good at teaching me crime, which he could do without anyone else knowing, that I had absolutely no idea until he'd told me the night before what to do. The other thing was, and I'd say to anyone, if you're interested in crime, try to prosecute early, because in prosecuting, it's all about the elements of an offence, and that will stand you in good stead whatever you do in the criminal law. So I had to learn elements from the very start, and I just took to it like a duck to water because I loved it. And again, it has a pure logic to it. So prosecuting for me was a fantastic way to learn crime, which helped me in what came later in my career, but I also just enjoyed it.
It's come up a few times in our preparation for this today that you love a story.
Yes, I really love a story, and every case has a story. And I remember going to court and being really anxious about addressing a jury for the first time, because very quickly in Hong Kong I was doing jury trials. And I said to Tony, I'm going to address a jury, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? And he said, just talk to them. Just tell them a story. He said, no oratory, just talk. And it was the best advice he could give me. So that really helped me settle into that sort of jury advocacy.
What was it like living in Hong Kong? Did you enjoy living there for 3 years?
It was absolutely fantastic. So everything that was wonderful about living in the Orient, it was just the most exciting place where you could learn so much about Chinese culture and life. It also had the British influence, so there was familiarity. And I know this sounds weird to younger listeners, but the most exciting thing was being able to shop at night. Because that's not something we could do in Australia at that point. So I can remember coming home from a dinner and we needed a light globe, and being able to buy it was just everything. So we loved it.
So this is the second time you've taken a break in your career, at least here in Melbourne. This wasn't a break in your career because you're working busily in Hong Kong. But again, coming back after 3 years in Hong Kong, did it take much effort to re-establish yourself, both you and Tony?
Look, it really didn't. And I was quite shocked when we said we were going to Hong Kong for 3 years, that a number of senior people thought it was a very bad career move. And they said things like, you realise you'll take silk later. Well, we were in our 20s and weren't really thinking about silk. And they couldn't have been more wrong anyway. It didn't hold us back in any way. Look, it's great for your own personal development. It's great just for your own life. And I don't think it adversely affects your career at all. For me, it specifically added because I learnt crime. For Tony, it didn't add as much, but he was doing very high-level cases, including Privy Council, and he wouldn't have had that opportunity here. So it was probably good. He came straight back in and was just flying in his criminal practice. I came back actually highly pregnant, and so I concentrated on that for a little while, had the baby, and then I was appointed to the Small Claims and Residential Tenancies Tribunal, so obviously I hadn't been forgotten in any way.
And did you just get the phone call out of the blue?
From memory, yes. I mean, I made a few phone calls, and there was just this, it is a combination of self-belief, but also an easier time. I can't take a lot of credit for this. It was an easier time, and it was a very good time for women because people were beginning to want women in roles. And so I've always said for every disadvantage in being female in the profession, there's been many, many advantages, just in terms of timing. I was born at the right time.
Yeah. As a baby boomer, I can say we've been on the cusp of change all the way through our lives. And
there's been many times where there's been some sort of preference. So I'm very conscious of all the very capable men who've missed out on roles in favour of capable women because people were making such an effort to right the imbalance.
You're part-time at the Small Claims Tribunal, Residential Tenancy Tribunal as well, and with a young baby, but soon thereafter you're a magistrate.
Yeah, I didn't last very long on the tribunal because I did then get a call to become a magistrate, and that did come out of the blue. And that's very much part of that opportunity that I was just referring to because the Attorney General had just started the law had just changed so that you had to be a lawyer to be a magistrate. Until then, of course, it was clerks of court who did an amazing job coming through the system, and there were very wise, very competent magistrates, but the system had just changed. And as part of that, the attorney clearly wanted to appoint some women.
And so Magistrates Court, doing crime, doing everything?
I started in the Children's Court. There's an irony in it, I think, because I was incredibly young and I was put with the youngest people, and probably it should be the other way round, that you have more maturity and life experience. So I was about 32, 33 when I started, and I did a year in the Children's Court where
Traumatic in the Children's Court?
Not traumatic, but very interesting for me because I had my own baby at that time, and I could see, I mentioned to you before, talk about the luck of the draw as to where you're born or who you're born to. You know, my little baby had all these loving people around him, just nurturing him. And I was dealing with babies who were, for example, born with a heroin addiction because their mum was a heroin addict. And their early experience of life was going through withdrawal symptoms and being on methadone. So you couldn't have a more stark contrast. But otherwise, no, I've never found any of the courts I've been in too traumatic. I've been very conscious of how hard the work has been and often how sad the work has been. But I've had a good mechanism somehow in turning off, switching off.
So you had a year in the Children's Court?
Yes.
And then back to the Magistrates Court?
Then the wonderful City Court under Darcy Dugan.
The old City Court?
The old City Court.
Up in Russell Street?
Yeah, where one day the tiles in the foyer there just all lifted spontaneously and magically. You know, the building was falling apart. But Darcy just ran such a brilliant court. You know, people often ask me about leaders, and I think they overlook some of the old school leaders like Darcy. He was the chief magistrate. He was someone who oversaw this massive change where clerks of court became magistrates and then lawyers became magistrates, and it could have been a really difficult combination. But under Darcy it wasn't. Everybody came together because he brought us together.
And he, as leader of that court, had been a clerk of courts himself.
Absolutely.
He wasn't a lawyer by training.
And he didn't need any sort of whiz-bang training in how to team build. He just did it instinctively. So there was an old apartment on the top of that magistrates' court, from an old caretaker's apartment, and every single morning we all met up there and had coffee before we went into court. And I learnt a lot. You know, some of the old school magistrates would be talking about sentencing and I'd be listening very, very hard. But he also had us laughing and talking, so we were just one.
In your work in the Magistrates Court and in other areas of your career, Linda, you've had a policy of saying yes to anything asked of you.
I really have. I think it's the fastest way to ensure a good trajectory in any role. If you show that you're willing and you step up, and particularly if you do the things that you don't necessarily want to do, and you make that clear that you are doing the things that you don't want to do, but you do it with a big smile and with great energy, I think you do then have the opportunity to be given things that you really do want to do. And that happened to me in my time in the Magistrates Court. At one stage, Darcy asked me to go and run the civil court for Melbourne Magistrates Court. And when I say asked, he asked me where I really had no choice. And I was incredibly disappointed. I was loving crime and I didn't want to go to do civil work. In fact, it was the best thing that could have happened because it was, again, a great learning time for me. Of course, I loved it because once you throw yourself in, you do. But it also meant that when I came back, I was able to say to him, I really do want to run the committals court. And he let me do that because I'd been so willing to do what I didn't want to do.
Before we get to the committals court, I'd just like to go back, and something that surprised me in reading about your work history was at the time that you are a magistrate and you are having a family, there was no maternity leave.
There was no maternity leave at all, but why I talk about Darcy as such an instinctive leader, he had two of us, Margaret Riscalla, who went on to be a county court judge, and me. We were both pregnant and no one knew what to do with us in terms of maternity leave. Well, Darcy didn't need to read any books or get any legal advice. He just said, well, you'll take off whatever time you need and you'll come back. And what that breeds is incredible loyalty. So I came back after about 4 or 5 months, I think, with our second son. And I would have done anything for Darcy. I would have done any work. I stayed late to do the bail applications no one else wanted to do, whatever it took. because he had been so decent with us. So he's a really great example of just innately good leadership.
You did mention, though, that you, through having done a whole lot of things that maybe other people didn't want to do, you were then offered whatever you wanted to do, and you chose the committals court.
I did.
Why was that?
Because I thought, two things. I thought it was exciting to be seeing the big criminal cases that would go on to other courts, and I also thought the system was quite broken, and I was enthusiastic to start trying to fix it. So everyone knows the committal court is about seeing whether there's enough prima facie evidence for a case to go on to the county court or the Supreme Court. And at that stage, everyone was just rolling their arm over. And I don't mean the magistrates, the lawyers, the police, everybody, so that it was just a formality and it was an incredible waste of time and a huge drain on the system. So I wanted to start working on ways in which we could make it more meaningful.
And how did you do that?
Well, one of the things that we identified very early is that people were never saying what their plea was going to be, because they had the option, if they were being committed, to say if they were pleading guilty or not guilty or reserving their plea. And there was nothing really compelling them to make a decision. And so they could just keep rolling it all along with nobody knowing how they were going to plead.
When you say make a decision, you're really saying nothing to compel them to say early on in the process, I'm going to plead guilty.
Exactly. So what that meant is that resources were being used right through the criminal justice system, in the magistrates' court, with all the police work, with the prosecutors' preparation of briefs, defence work, and then someone would plead guilty. And, of course, some of them shouldn't plead guilty, some people shouldn't. That's fine. All I wanted to do was to ensure that as early as possible we took out the guilty pleas from the system and got them to where they needed to be so that we didn't waste resources. And I was lucky enough to get a Churchill Fellowship where I was able to study ways to achieve that.
So you applied for a Churchill Fellowship, and you received it?
I did.
What did that entail? Not the application, but the actual fellowship itself.
It's actually interesting because it was about 1993 or 1994 that I applied, and I applied because I wanted to fix that, but also I was getting a bit restless. So again, it's that taking control, which I would urge people to do in a good way, of thinking, well, what would I like to do next? And then trying to back themselves. Churchill Fellowships are amazing, and I'm always happy to have the opportunity to say this so people know about them. Set up after Churchill passed away with a corpus of money, a scholarship program that allows people from around Australia to go overseas to study all different things, and it's not dependent on your academic background. So the year I went to study ways to reduce cost and delay in the criminal justice system, a blacksmith also received a Churchill, and someone who specialised in museum glass got a Churchill. So it's really something to bear in mind for people with a broad range of interests. And I got to go to some of the worst crime centres in North America and the UK to see how they had sped their systems up and where they had found that there was congestion in the system and what they'd done about it. So it was a fantastic opportunity for me to come back with full support from every level of court in Victoria to start implementing some of the learnings in our court here.
I would have thought to encourage someone to plead guilty early on in the process, there would need to be a carrot.
And, you know, things that probably criminal lawyers, the new young criminal lawyers take for granted, like, lower sentences if you plead guilty, they hadn't started then. So they're the sorts of mechanisms that were brought into place. And why I say we got the support of the whole system was it was readily recognised it wasn't just about the Magistrates' Court. And so I was very lucky that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Phillips, was particularly keen to learn more of what I'd learnt in my travels. And so the Pegasus report was published because he set up a little task force, and I was able to get everything from this task force put into a report as to how better to speed up the criminal justice system.
That's probably a contentious point. Is the criminal justice system quick enough? Did you see measurable results?
We did. We absolutely saw measurable results. We saw a huge increase in the number of early guilty pleas. Not that people who wouldn't have pleaded guilty were suddenly pleading guilty. That was never the aim.
No.
But they were doing it in a timely way. But it also meant looking at things like how the police and forensic processes worked. So there was huge delays then, and this might resonate with today, but I'm out of it now, so I don't know. There were huge delays then with getting drug testing results. So part of it too was if you get those results early, then people will plead early and then you won't waste all the money in the system. So it was often about front-end resourcing. Put more money into the forensics at the beginning so that you don't have people wasting much more money going right through the system for no good reason.
Mm-hmm. Soon after this, you're appointed to the family court?
Yes.
Was there any connection between the two? Or
Not that I know of. And it was a big decision because I loved crime, but there was no question that in the court hierarchy it was a big promotion to go to a federal court and a higher court. And Alistair Nicholson was the Chief Justice, and it was really in the heyday of the family court where there was enormous energy and commitment to following that dream of the legislation where there'd be no fault and people would be treated equally, and we'd have fantastic psychologists who were helping reach decisions about children. So it was an exciting time.
You've said that you can't imagine legal work which is more important than family court work. Why is that?
Because if you're making a decision as to whether a young child will or will not know his or her father or mother growing up as a result of your decision, I can't imagine anything more important because there is no way back from that decision. If they've lost the first 18 years of their life with a parent or 10 or whatever, you can't fix that later. So I think it's a fundamentally important part of our community as to how well we handle families.
As a distant observer of the family court system, it appears to me it can be a very highly charged environment with a great deal of anger and angst. Is there any way, or can a judge affect that? Can a judge try to settle things down a bit, make people a bit more understanding of each other?
I think you can keep the temperature down in court. That's one thing. So as voices rise, mine would always lower. Very calm, very quiet way of just making everyone realise that they're getting too high and too hot. In terms of the decisions, look, I always took the approach, and really the wonderful Justice John Fogarty told me this at the very beginning, which was try to do no harm. I think if you go into a court like the family court thinking you'll fix everyone's problems, you'll become disappointed and jaded because you're not with people 24/7. You're with them for such a finite period of time. But if you can feel with some pride that you've done no harm to that family, I think that's a much healthier way of proceeding and of having longevity, which I did end up having in that court just because I was young when I was appointed. And, I think it helped me cope with it very happily for a long time.
And you found it satisfying? You found satisfaction in your work as a family court judge?
I loved it. And, Alistair, again, was an amazing Chief Justice for me. I was very young and very new, and he gave me the licence to work on things that I thought were important and that he thought were important to improve the system. And I must say, under Diana Bryant, that continued too. So I had lots of opportunities for different projects, which kept me interested and involved. So I never got bored across the 18 years. And in terms of coping, look, I think a couple of things I'd advise any lawyer. One is make sure you do a lot of extracurricular activities, community activities, because that takes you way away from the stresses of work. And also just make sure you enjoy family time, whatever shape of family you have. For me, and not everyone will have children or choose to have children, for me having kids really helped because, as anyone who does have them knows, once you get home, they don't really care what you've been doing all day. They just want your full attention to get their tennis racket, properly stringed or to remind you haven't got what they needed for school the next day, whatever it is. So that kept me very grounded and calm because I completely forget about work once I got home.
Coming from a prior generation, not so much to you, Linda, but of the current generation now, what advice would you give to couples like yourself and Tony, where you both got highly pressured, highly responsible jobs which take a lot of time? Would you give young couples advice on how to juggle that, how to manage that?
No, I certainly wouldn't, because I just don't think there is anything to say other than it's a juggle. It's a continuous juggle. You know, people laugh because I say I took a career hit by going to the Magistrate's Court because I really wanted to stay at the bar. My preference would have been to stay at the bar. We had met at the bar. We were both barristers. Our careers were going well. But having just had a family, I thought and felt it was unsustainable at that stage for us to have two of us with such uncertain hours because, as any barrister knows, if you take a brief, you work on it, whether it's midnight or 3 a.m. I must say, as a judge, when someone told me they'd only recently received the brief, unless it was, that morning or something exceptional, I would really think, well, yeah, so what's the problem? You would have worked all weekend if you got it on Friday, because that's what we did. And obviously it wasn't such a bad career move, but that was a negotiation between us that Tony was more senior at the bar. His career was more advanced at that point, so I took the other role. So there's those sorts of negotiations. Otherwise, it's just a juggle. And if anyone's got a magic answer to how to make it easy, they'll make a fortune. But I haven't got the answer.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
In an extremely interesting career where you've managed to juggle various balls by having projects on the side as well as your judicial work, one of the things that interests me is you teaching judgment writing to judges.
Yes.
Was it necessary? Is it necessary? And are there any principles to judgment writing?
Michael, have you ever read judgments?
I tried not to, Linda.
Yeah, and you probably tried not to because they were so unreadable. So I mentioned how Alistair Nicholson really facilitated so many things for me. There was a judgment writing course in New Zealand being taught by an American professor of rhetoric, Jim Raymond, and Alistair asked who wanted to go, and of course I said I'd love to go. And I was absolutely smitten. I knew there was a better way to write judgments than I'd been writing them, let alone other people. Now, I should say there are certain judges who are just natural writers. They're brilliant judgment writers, but they're incredibly few. They're the chosen people who just can write perfectly and succinctly and in an interesting but brief way. Most of us are good writers, but not fantastic at judgment writing. So we set up a course for judgment writing here, and we followed the model in New Zealand by having writers working with us. So, for example, at the first course we did for judges, we had Helen Garner as one of the writers, and she was absolutely fantastic because she would say to the judges, "You are murdering the best material." She'd say, "Do you realise how much, we as writers would love to have this material, and you completely disguise it." And so we taught about writing a story, whatever it's about, and you'd see some, Superior Court judges looking like, "I write about commercial law, where's the story?" Well, the answer is there's a story in everything. It's always about who did what to whom or who's arguing about what. And so the brief description I'd give you is I would say to judges when we were teaching this, if you want some help from the judge next door to you in chambers, do you really walk in and say, "Pursuant to section 43 of the such and such act," and they'd be going, "What are you talking about?" You would walk in and say, "I've got this case where this man, ran over a pedestrian," and you'd start from there and you'd tell the story. Very much Lord Denning, but without the flourishes. So a group of us probably taught nearly every judge in Australia at one point, and it was really gratifying to see people changing their own judgment writing style, because you have to bring judgments to the course. So you feel really exposed. You've got experts looking at them and other judges looking at them, and you rewrite them in the course of the course. And there is the most beautiful pride, not only from the judge who's rewritten their work, but from the other judges who've been working with them and watching as you learn to do it better. One of the reasons I loved being a judge for as long as I did was that I never thought I perfected that art. And so it was always something I was pursuing and always something I was trying to get better at, which meant the challenge never left me.
And those courses continue on, don't they?
They do. They do. Because the other thing we taught was we started a national judicial orientation program, and every judge in Australia does those programs. You know, it doesn't sound like anything much now, but adult education, let alone for judges, that was really controversial when I was a young judge.
It's interesting you're mentioning Helen Garner. She's a former guest on the podcast. And with her saying to the judges, you've got this magnificent material which you're murdering, it then makes sense with the series of books she wrote, sitting in the back of courts following trials.
Yeah, she became more and more interested in courts. She also became very affectionately disposed towards judges. She began to understand the issues for them in writing and the conflicts of what they were trying to achieve. So she was a terrific teacher.
On my rough calculations here, Linda, after maybe 35 years as a judicial officer, magistrate and family court judge?
No, I think it was more like 28.
30-odd years. Yeah. 2015, you're appointed Governor of Victoria.
Yes.
The first female governor?
Yes.
The first Jewish governor?
Yes.
What a huge honour.
Yes.
On your theory of accept every or take up every challenge offered to you, to take on every job that's offered to you, did you instantly say yes, or did you go home to Tony, talk about it, think about it, you know?
Oh, I mean, both, but I had no doubts at all. I knew it would be the most wonderful, not only privilege, but opportunity. And it was. I did it for 8 years and felt the same excitement about every day that I'd felt from the beginning.
Maybe we better go back to the start of constitutional law.
Yes.
What is the position of a governor?
Yes.
How does that position come into existence? And what is the role of the governor?
Okay, well, the governor represents the head of state, and that's currently, of course, King Charles. Importantly, and people will debate whether that's a system we should have in Australia, and that's healthy. And at some stage, the community might decide it differently from the way they decided it last time. But I'm more than happy to talk about the role, because I hope that the actual role, however our head of state becomes in the future, I really hope that a role like this continues. There are four main parts to it. One is constitutional. So it's someone sitting above the elected officials of the day, which is a very healthy thing, so that there is someone who's outside the political fray, who obviously looks after just keeping an eye on the constitutional aspects of life in the state. There's the ceremonial role, so it's the governor you will see representing the community at, for example, Anzac Day. And again, that's important because when the governor stands on the steps of the shrine and addresses the public, they're not addressing Liberal supporters, Labor supporters or any other supporters. They're addressing everybody without that political overlay. There's the international engagement, which in this century is an incredibly important part of the work. Victoria, like any other part of Australia, can't function without huge international links, both culturally and economically. And then there's the major part of the role, which is bringing the community together, celebrating what's good in the community, trying to lead the concept of harmony, unity and achievement. So they're the basic parts of the role.
To me, as a distant observer, I would assume it's pretty well a 24/7 role.
It's a big role, but the joy is it is what you make of it. So you have a fair bit of licence to say, I've seen this small group in Box Hill who are trying to revegetate the nature strips with native plants, and I would like to thank them for that. I mean, it goes through from that to welcoming Vice President Biden as he was then here. But it's the opportunity to recognise people in the community who otherwise might not be recognised for amazingly good work, which is at the heart of a strong community.
And really important role within our community, as you say. You being you, with always having a side project on the go, introduced a personal project into your role as governor.
Yes.
So could you tell us about that, please?
Well, there was obviously a lot of talk about me being the first female governor, and overall I was adamant that it wasn't about being a female governor or a Jewish governor or a lawyer governor or AFL, anything else I'd been involved in, because I was a governor for everybody. But I did want to, particularly being the first woman, I did want to note it in a separate way. So Tony and I got together and decided that our family would donate a particular project, a particular development at the house. So we brought back a part of the property that had a
When you say that this is Government House there.
Oh, the house, yeah,
Government House.
Sorry, yeah.
Up there near the Botanical Gardens.
That house, yeah. Government House. And that we brought back a big community garden, kitchen garden, and grew wonderful produce that was used at the house. But most importantly, we wanted a community project around it. I was absolutely convinced, watching in the courts across the years, that obviously happy parents make for happy children. And I looked at the people coming to Australia, having had that background myself through my dad, and I could see that often what happened was that the men in a family who came, they assimilated quite quickly because they went out to work. The kids were comfortable because they went off to school, but the mums were often the isolated ones. And we felt strongly that if the women could feel more connected, then the family would be healthier and the children would be happier living here too. So we created a program for recently arrived women who were identified as being quite isolated, and they came in for a term each in groups, and they did some gardening. I can assure you they weren't gardening in that we had gardeners, but they would save little jobs like picking tomatoes and things, and then there'd be cooking, and then they'd have competitions, as it turned out, as to who made the best spring rolls or the best dolmadas or whatever it was. And then each group did different things. There'd be singing, dancing, but lots of laughing, lots of talking, lots of practising English by just being together. And so it was a joy to watch how that program worked.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
Now, I've left till almost last, of course, the most important role you've ever played, which is to be a significant player in AFL football.
Well, that seems to be the opinion that the chair of the AFL had when he heard that I had become governor or was going to, and he asked me why I was taking a demotion. So there seems to be some view about that.
So tell us, what have been your roles in AFL football?
Look, I'm an Essendon supporter, so I've always thought you had the wrong stripe, the wrong colour. And I started by getting involved there by starting a women's network. So I could see that women weren't being properly embraced by clubs, and Essendon had a terrific chief executive at the time, Peter Jackson, a man of real vision. And I contacted him, completely cold call, and said to him I'd like to meet a few other women and maybe get involved with them, Essendon supporters. He immediately said, look, I think we should be doing something bigger than that. I think there's an opportunity that none of the clubs have taken up. I'm saying all this because I keep getting the credit for it, but really Peter had the vision that all clubs should be doing more to embrace female supporters. So he asked me the question that has always made me smile. It was, would you mind having lunch with Kevin Sheedy? So the answer was, I wouldn't mind at all. And
a former Richmond player, I should say.
Yeah, he had a little bit to do with Essendon as well, from memory. He had lunch with me and a group of women that we'd brought together, including Joan Kerner, who was Premier and, as people might remember, an ardent Essendon supporter. Very sweet moment at that lunch when Joan asked Kevin for his autograph and he said, "Who do I make it out to?" And she said, "Joan." It hadn't occurred to him that the Premier would want his autograph, but she really wanted his autograph. And so we got together and we started a network, and then I helped the other clubs do it because I knew that we weren't in competition. A Richmond supporter wasn't going to come to our network and vice versa. And so we started them across all the clubs. So that was my first involvement with AFL. They were really successful. Women decide a lot of the discretionary spend, so it was good for merchandise and events and memberships. And the clubs began to take the female supporters more seriously. So Peter Jackson gave us really good football content as a group, which is what the male coteries had always had. And then subsequently they wanted to appoint a woman to the AFL Commission. And it came down to two candidates. I was one of them and they appointed the other. Not shabby, Sam Mostyn, who's a fantastic woman in the business world. And then they appointed me soon after.
And did you enjoy it, particularly being on the commission?
I absolutely loved it. And I did about 7 or 8 years. Some of my friends who don't understand footy said, why is someone, serious like you, a judge, interested in something like that? And that showed they didn't understand where football stood in our community, because it's everything. It's a fabulous sport, beautiful to watch and exciting, but it's also glue that binds the community. It's what helps newcomers settle. And the fact that it was dealing with difficult social issues like drugs at the time I went on particularly attracted me, because it started hard conversations. And I know many people thought it was no business of football to do that. I disagree with that. With its following, I think it was a responsible thing to do. But it started the hard conversations that weren't necessarily being started anywhere else. And I absolutely loved it. I loved the grassroots and I loved the elite.
I think we all do. I agree with you. It is the glue that holds our community together, I think, AFL football in the southern states of Australia. So, Linda, you've now finished your term as governor and you are settling into a quiet retirement.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want. I don't want to do anything else ever again. Michael, please goodness, we're all going to have some good lifespan nowadays with medical science being what it is. Look, I can't imagine not working. My father worked well into his 90s, and I just think as long as you can, you do, because I can't imagine what it looks like otherwise for me.
Could you see yourself working in some sort of legal role or a general community role?
I could see myself not working in law. Okay, nothing personal. I've done it and done it for a long time, but I'll certainly keep going in various community organisations.
Well, now to wrap it up, you're someone who has always been up for a challenge, always looking for something new and interesting and worthwhile to do and to engage you. Young lawyers coming through, both young and not so young lawyers, any lawyers coming through, reflecting on your life, your career, what would you say to them?
Well, I've said some of it, so I'm happy to sort of collect it here. I think they should back themselves. I've noticed, I've had a lot of young people working around me across the last few years, both as a judge but across many years and then as governor. And there is a tendency amongst some of them to say the things they don't want to do or to set the benchmarks for what they want in their job. And I still do say nothing beats hard work. Nothing beats being really willing to work and being really pleasant when you're doing it. It sounds so kind of homespun and probably very soft, but those skills will actually carry you a long way. So in the workplace, I feel just nothing beats hard work and that willingness. Backing yourself is important because you should have ideas and you should pursue them, and some of them won't work and that doesn't matter, but just go for it. And the other thing that I think is essential is to have interests outside the law. Just, you are part of a much wider community And not only is it right to be contributing to the community that supports you so well, but it's also just good fun and interesting. And if you leave a hard day in court and you go to the local basketball club to referee a game, or, you go and do some charity work, whatever it is, it will just make you feel better and be happier. So that's probably it.
Linda, thank you for a most engrossing chat this morning. Really, I would love all of the young lawyers to listen to what you've had to say, particularly your concluding comments. And thank you on behalf of Victorians for the great contribution you have made to our community yourself.
Well, thank you. And I know the contribution that the clerks here make. And you made a huge contribution for a long time, and to footy, even if it was the wrong coloured stripe. So thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Linda.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greenslist clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.